Whereas for Spengler, being, more or less, in the sense of these symbols, pre-exists their cultural creations in an almost Platonic way. It just sort of sits there in the soul of the culture and acts almost as a sort of genotype of which the culture forms just simply realize and manifest this sense of this particular sense of being. Just as, for example, in Western Europe, the Gothic cathedral realizes the sense of infinite space, just as the infinitesimal calculus realizes this sense of boundless infinity, just as classical music with its creation of polyphony realizes this sense of infinity. And you can hear that in Bach's cantatas. If you listen to them, you really do experience this. Bach's cantatas are the equivalent in music of the cathedral, this sense of infinite expansion in these cantatas. They're amazing. Or the depth perspective in painting that comes in with the Renaissance. All of that is consistent with realizing this sort of pre-established idea of being. Spengler, in this sense, then, is a being as infinite space. Spengler is, in this sense, more or less a traditional metaphysician whose theory presupposes that there are these objective, abstract, ontologically valid realities. They may be specific to each culture, but within each culture, they're locally a priori, as it were. They're sort of local a prioris. And then he also critiques Kant's idea where Kant had taken space and time and said that they were the transcendental aesthetic. They're the a priori forms built into the way the human mind is able to think or perceive anything that happens in the world, and they are therefore universally valid for all time. But Spengler says this is not the case. The Kantian a priori is really only the a priori for Faustian civilization, which experiences space as this infinite, boundless expanse, and that these a priori, the Kantian a priori was really invalidated by the discovery of non-Euclidean geometries, starting with Gauss and Riemann in the 19th century. The discovery of non-Euclidean geometries, that there were different kinds of sets of geometry, invalidated the universality of Kant's geometry, which largely rested upon the validity of Euclidean geometry. Spengler, though, it seems to me, misses a little bit of McLuhan is necessary as a corrective here to Spengler, I think, because he misses the sense that possibly that this idea of infinite space really is not necessarily the way that Western civilization as a whole understands being, but only the way it's understood in a particular limited epoch, let's say the epoch extending from the 15th century down to about the middle of the 19th century, in which indeed this is the epoch in which depth perspective in painting is worked out, and the classical music and the infinitesimal calculus. And Spengler's insights about the ontological nature, the essence of Western civilization, seem to me to be relativized just to this epoch, as Gebser points out, and that the discovery, as McLuhan points out, of non-Euclidean geometries in the 19th century is a different kind of space feeling altogether, and announces the shift from what McLuhan called visual space. The kind of space, I think, that Spengler is saying is infinite space, is really what McLuhan calls visual space, that is abstract, rationally conceived space based on Euclidean geometry, in which space is a function of the eye. That creates an abstract spatial field. The sense of vision is stepped up away from the other senses, and an abstract Euclidean three-dimensional visual space is conceived. Then, with the coming in of non-Euclidean geometries and the rise of electric technologies in the 19th century, and Spengler missed the difference between mechanical technologies and electric technologies. With the rise of non-Euclidean geometries, there was a shift from visual space to acoustic space, which is discontinuous. So we have multiple manifolds, multiple geometrical manifolds, as the prelude, of course, to Einsteinian dynamics of moving bodies, in which each body creates its own frame of reference with its own time, its own causality, and its own set of moving equations that are relative to all the others. That's what McLuhan called this world. It's discontinuous because the sense of sight is stepped down, the acoustic sense is stepped up. Acoustic space is indeed 360, since sound comes at us from all directions, and therefore everything comes at us all at once, and this is consistent with the rise of the electric Umwelt, in which, beginning with the telegraph, knowledge and information starts beaming into us, bombarding us from all directions all at once, and we begin to get this epoch of information overload. But this is a completely different understanding of being now that I think Spengler missed. And I think that in missing it, what he's done actually is he's correctly perceived that the older idea, the infinite space idea, which is basically what Gebser calls the perspectival epoch of Western civilization, the decline of the West is really the decline of the perspectival consciousness structure, the decline of the idea of infinite space. Gebser's late phase, the late phase of the rational consciousness structure, which he says is the perspectival phase, he's really, with the decline of the West, talking about the decline of that particular epoch of the West's understanding of being and mistaking it for the disintegration of the culture as a whole. Although I don't think, on the other hand, that his insights about the shift from culture to civilization are rendered invalid thereby. I think we can say that if there's anything in Spengler that needs to be saved, in the way that Adorno says in his book, or the way that Zizek says in the preface that he writes to Adorno's book about Wagner, why Wagner is worth saving, as though Wagner needed to be saved. I think we could say that if there's anything in Spengler that can be saved, it's the absolute validity. They've got this dead on, in my opinion, that all cultures shift from a great culture period that is lyrically motivated by metaphysics and religion and myth and art to a megalopolitan civilization phase in which those values decline and disintegrate, and the rise of the cosmopolis with its practical, its banal, prosaic concern with merely practical and economic and political and social problems takes center stage. The metaphysical and artistic problems get pushed into the background, and you begin to get the late megalopolitan intellectual who thinks that everything in the world picture can simply be sterilized by the light of reason and all mysteries can be sheared away. I think he got that dead on. That is the case in every one of these civilizations. Even though I think that he didn't understand this shift from one type of spatial conception and world feeling to the next that is clarified for us by Gebser and McLuhan as the shift from visual to acoustic in McLuhan, or from perspectival to aperspectival, or what Gebser also calls the integral consciousness structure in his work Ever-Present Origin. And by integral consciousness structure, that term is chosen very carefully to indicate that what is happening is not just a disintegration and decline in the 19th century, although that definitely is taking place, but also in the higher culture forms, in modernist art and in modernist physics. What's happening is an integration of structures that are being pulled together and integrated. Space is put together with time and Einstein, and Bauhaus architecture outside is put together with the inside with the glass wall that eliminates the distinction between them. In Jungian psychology, the male is brought together with the female. In the rise of feminism and so forth, the male and female are brought together and balanced. All these things are brought together. All the things that Western civilization had been pulling apart with the rise of its creation of a world as nature picture in which everything is dissected, exactly as though nature were a gigantic dead body, that the West arrived at all of its insights about nature and the construction of its world as nature picture by dissecting this dead body and pulling it apart. Gebser's integral consciousness structure begins to come in and put it all back together, which I think also Heidegger is doing in his own way, putting the subject back together with the object, embedding the subject into a particular life world. He's putting things back together too that Western philosophy has pulled apart like a dead body. So I think Spengler missed the significance of this shift, and correspondingly he also missed the significance of Poincaré's discovery of the basis of the mathematical attractor theory that will become the basis of chaos theory and chaos dynamics. He missed that also, as William F. Thompson points out in some of his writings that are critical about Spengler. So that brings me to everything pretty much that I wanted to say about Spengler's intuition of the connection between space and death in this chapter. In the next chapter, we'll move on into a more specific discussion of the Apollonian, Faustian, and Magian souls and the structures of each one of them in the next step.